Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval world that smells like damp wool, smoky candles, and freshly brewed ale. Picture this, a frost-covered convent nestled on a hill in 13th century Germany. The bells have yet to chime for morning prayers, but already there's movement in the lower cloisters. Not from the chapel, no, not yet, but from the brewery. A room filled with the scent of warm mash and the low hiss of boiling liquid. It's not the monks stirring. It's the nuns. And they are getting ready to brew. You're groggy as you shuffle down the stone corridor. The air is cold, the floor's colder. You pass sisters in heavy habits, moving in quiet procession toward the brewing chamber. One of them, tall, strong-looking, with sleeves rolled to the elbow, nods at you. That's Sister Bertha. She'll be in charge of today's batch. Her hands are already stained from barley and yeast. You wonder if she ever actually prays, or if she's always elbows deep in fermentation. Oh, and a quick reality check. You probably wouldn't survive this. Between the early wake-up calls, the vow of silence, and the daily menu of turnips, pottage, and low-alcohol beer, your modern sensibilities would tap out before Compline. Still sound relaxing? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing where in the world you're all tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You follow Sister Bertha into the brewing chamber. It's warm here, a kind of sleepy warmth, where barley steams in a massive copper kettle and sunlight cuts through stained glass, striping the air with color. The brewing starts before the first prayers, and there's a reason for that. Brewing takes time, not just hours but days. It also takes silence, patience, and the kind of organization that convent life absolutely excels at. The sisters don't brew just for fun, of course. This is daily nourishment. Back then, water wasn't exactly crystal clear. It came from wells, ditches, and public fountains often shared with livestock. Germ theory wouldn't be a twinkle in anyone's eye for another 500 years. So instead of drinking straight water, people, especially those in religious orders, relied on beer, or more precisely, small ale, a very low alcohol, lightly fermented drink brewed fresh each week. It was clean, filling, and had just enough alcohol to kill off waterborne pathogens, but not so much that it made morning mass a dangerous sport. You ladle a sip from a wooden cup. It's warm, not cold and fizzy like a modern pint. Earthy, slightly sour, with a hint of whatever herbs the sisters had on hand. No hops yet, not in most places. That comes later. This is simpler stuff. Think liquid bread with a sprinkle of mint. Historians still argue whether nuns brewed exclusively for their own community or whether they routinely traded with locals under the radar. Some believe certain convents became low-key community beer hubs, offering clean drink to villagers in exchange for labor or supplies. Others claim the brewing was internal, devotional, and tightly regulated. The truth? Like most medieval things, it probably depended on the century, the country, and the abbot's mood. But here, in your sleepy little cloister, the rhythm is clear. Brew in the early hours. Let it ferment quietly as prayers are whispered. Bottle it before vespers. Drink sparingly. Share freely. The equipment's nothing fancy. A mash tun, a copper boiling kettle, buckets, strainers made from horsehair or cloth, and giant wooden paddles for stirring. The sisters lift these with ease. Forget the image of the frail nun bent in prayer. Some of these women are tank-armed and calloused, just as likely to lift a sack of barley as a book of hours. Sister Agnes, the oldest among them, walks with a slow limp, but you swear she can still outbrew anyone else. Her secret? Stir clockwise in silence, counterclockwise in song. No one's sure why, but it seems to work. And yes, the nuns prayed over the brew, but not in the mystical way you might think. Prayers were part of everything. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, gardening, tending the sick, and yes, brewing. They weren't asking the ale to become holy wine. They were asking it not to spoil, explode, or make everyone violently ill. Reasonable goals. One sister scribbles in a little book, noting the boil time and temperature, as best as medieval tools allow. These records matter. Brewing, for nuns, was also about discipline and reproducibility, long before anyone knew the word science. As the light outside rises and the steam thickens, your eyes get heavy. The pace here is slow, repetitive, comforting. One sister kneads a sack of malted barley like bread dough. Another gently checks the fermenting cask, listening for bubbles like it's a baby breathing in sleep. A cat walks across the rafters. Nobody minds. Convents always had cats. They kept the grain stores mouse-free and occasionally got tipsy lapping up spilled ale. And yes, if you're wondering, sometimes they accidentally brewed it too strong. A triple ale might sneak in if the barley ratio was high and fermentation time long. Did that stop the sisters from drinking it? Sometimes. Other times, let's just say Vespers got a little more enthusiastic. Even now, Sister Bertha wipes foam from the rim of a barrel, gives you a wink, and mutters, "This one's got spirit." You're pretty sure she means it literally. Before the next bell tolls for morning prayers, the fire is banked low, and the steam has faded. You feel it, the strange calm that comes from repetitive labor, warm air, and barley-scented robes. A nun hums faintly, not a hymn, a brewing song passed down from sister to sister. And you're just along for the ride. You step out of the brewing chamber and into the cool stone corridor again, trailing steam and barley scent like a cloak. The nuns have gone quiet, drifting back toward their other duties. But you linger, because you're not done with this mystery yet. How did nuns, of all people, get so good at brewing? To understand that, you've got to go back, way back, to when the earliest monasteries were still sketchy little clusters of wooden huts. You're walking now through a centuries-old memory, past hand-dug wells and small wooden altars. Monks and nuns alike are living rough, scraping together enough food and drink to survive, often isolated from towns, often completely self-sufficient. They grow their food, they raise chickens, and crucially, they ferment. Fermentation is one of those ancient, slightly magical processes that medieval people didn't totally understand, but absolutely relied on. Leave grain soaking long enough, add the right herbs, warm it over fire, and if the gods are kind or the saints are listening, you get beer. It's not fancy, it's not filtered, but it's safe to drink. And in the Dark Ages, that was nothing short of miraculous. You pass a dusty alcove where a nun is mashing up stale bread to reuse for brewing. Waste not. That's rule number 1 here. Every scrap of barley, every crust of bread, even wild hops, if they've got them, gets put to use. It's not about profit. It's about not dying of dysentery. Cozy. Historians still argue whether early brewing was more experimental or rote. Some think the religious orders had notebooks full of detailed measurements and procedures, handed down like family recipes. Others think it was more vibes-based. Stir until it smells right. Boil until the cat leaves the room. Honestly, both sound plausible. As you move down the hall, you stop by the convent's small herbarium. Rows of dried herbs hang from the rafters: yarrow, rosemary, mugwort, maybe even a sprig of wormwood if Sister Helga was feeling bold. Remember, hops weren't yet the standard. They were still a strange novelty in many places, especially for nuns brewing in Northern Europe. Instead, grut, the ancient herbal blend used to flavor and preserve ale, was the norm. You sniff a bundle of dried herbs and get a hit of lavender and bitter wild thyme. It smells like sleepy afternoons and ancient medicine. That's because it was medicine. Brewing wasn't just about hydration. It was about healing. Nuns brewed stronger alesh for pilgrims, for the sick, for other nuns recovering from fevers. Some even doubled as apothecaries, balancing prayer with a solid understanding of which herb soothed which pain. Sister Hildegard of Bingen comes to mind. She's basically the Beyoncé of medieval nuns. Abbess, mystic, composer, and yes, brewer. She was one of the earliest figures to write about hops and their preservative properties. Did she drink? Debatable. Did she brew? Absolutely. And she wasn't the only one. There's a quiet pride in the way the nuns handle the brewing process. Not flashy, not boastful, just efficient. Just good. Some convents produced beer that rivaled anything the local monks could make. But because the church didn't like the idea of women running economic ventures, much of their brewing stayed under the radar. Historians still argue whether this was an act of quiet defiance or simply practicality. Either way, the sisters kept brewing. You step back into the brew chamber, and there's Sister Bertha again, sleeves rolled up, face flushed. She's adjusting the fire under the copper kettle, using a long iron poker like it's a sacred tool. Around her, the mash bubbles softly, thick, golden, nearly alive. She gestures to a small painted panel nailed above the door. It's Saint Bridget of Kildare, the unofficial patroness of nuns and, get this, of brewers. According to legend, she once turned her bathwater into beer for visiting bishops. That's multitasking, and yes, you smile. Because of course a woman who led a monastery and made her own ale would end up as the patron saint of fermentation. Makes sense, doesn't it? The day grows long outside. A bell tolls in the distance, and somewhere someone is chanting a psalm. But here in the brewery, time feels suspended. The mash settles, the fire hisses low, and a cat is curled on a sack of barley like it owns the place. Probably does. You run your hand along the wooden barrel. It's warm, alive. You can feel the faint hum of fermentation beneath your fingertips. It's easy to forget this isn't just food. It's chemistry. Wild yeasts from the air, sugars from the grain, herbs to flavor, heat to coax it all together. A delicate dance, and the nuns are master choreographers, and they don't waste a drop. The thicker sludge from the bottom of the barrel gets used in bread or fed to animals. The leftover mash becomes gruel. Even the foam, called barm, is sometimes skimmed off and used as leavening in baking. Nothing is discarded. Everything is repurposed. Your favorite 21st century sustainability blog has nothing on 12th century nuns. By now, your eyelids are heavy. The warm air, the slow fire, the rhythmic sounds. It's hypnotic. Sister Agnes hums again, this time a lullaby. You recognize it from the morning, though it's slower now, almost drowsy. She stirs the ale like she's tucking it in for the night. And you're not far behind. You wake, barely, to the sound of gentle footsteps and the clink of a ladle against metal. The brewery is cooler now, the fire banked down to a soft glow. You're still in the convent, still wrapped in the cozy barley-sweet warmth of the brew chamber. You stretch, blink slowly, and realize Sister Bertha has moved on to the next step in her methodical, sacred routine. You're here just in time for the transfer. The mash, that thick porridge of warm grain and water, is ready to be strained. There's no industrial strainer, no chrome equipment, just wooden buckets, linen cloth, and patience. You watch as the warm liquid, now called wort, gets poured slowly through a sackcloth filter into a waiting vat. It's a glowy amber color, like honey caught in candlelight. It smells faintly of biscuits, damp earth, and chamomile. The sisters are quiet now, focused. It's meditative, really like prayer with ladles. It might surprise you that all of this brewing knowledge was passed down not through manuals, but through memory. The brewing nun was often a senior sister, one who'd learned from the one before her. Historians still argue whether some convents had full instruction books or if they depended solely on oral tradition. Likely it was both, a mixture like their ale. You sidle closer to the barrels and spot a carved rune on one of the wooden staves. It's not Latin. It's not even fully decipherable. Some say these marks were signatures, brewing codes to identify the sister or batch. Others argue they were protective charms. Brewing was tricky business, and when a barrel went bad, you didn't always blame the yeast, you blamed the spirits. And while we're on the subject of spirits, not the kind that get you tipsy, you should know that brewing wasn't always seen as pure work. It had an aura of the mystical. After all, you're creating something that bubbles, expands, hisses, and smells alive. It's a little unnerving, like something might wake up in the vat and say hello. So, some convents sang psalms over their beer, not just to pass the time, but to bless it, to keep whatever mischief might be lurking at bay. One particularly fun tidbit you'll love? In some regions, it was customary to name the brewery's largest fermenting vessel. That's right. These were big, wooden tubs, practically hot tubs, and each one had a name like Agatha or the Good Lady. You glance at a chalk scribble on the side of one enormous barrel here. It reads, charmingly, Saint Froth. It might be a joke or maybe not. Either way, it makes you smile. You walk a slow loop around the fermenting barrels. It's cool down here, stone walls sweating with condensation. You hear the occasional plop of foam, the soft creak of wood expanding in the moist air. It's almost like the beer is breathing. And here's where things get delicate. Fermentation is a waiting game. The yeast, which lives invisibly in the air and on the grain, gets to work now. It eats the sugar in the wort and produces alcohol and bubbles. But the sisters can't see this. They just know it works. Or it should. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers understood yeast at all. Some think they thought it was divine intervention. Others believe they recognized yeast behavior without fully understanding the microbiology. Either way, it worked. Sister Bertha doesn't need a microscope. She just knows the temperature, the smell, the color. She's seen this happen hundreds of times. And she trusts it. You hear a soft chuckle from one of the older sisters. She's telling the story, half-whispered, of the batch that exploded. Yes, really. A particularly lively fermentation once caused a barrel lid to blow clean across the cellar. They say it hit the far wall so hard it left a dent. The novices still point it out like a badge of honor. Brewing isn't for the faint of heart. And here's where things get even more interesting. Because unlike monks, who often sold their beer to fund massive abbeys and monasteries, many nuns brewed just for the community. Their ale didn't hit the local taverns. It nourished the sick, warmed the cold, fed the guests, and helped the sisters sleep. Ale was also part of daily rations. Yes, that means you, as a visiting guest, would receive bread, cheese, and beer. Breakfast of champions. And not a weak brew either. Some nunneries were known for surprisingly potent batches. Not that anyone admitted it. But a few cheeky parish records hint at visiting bishops leaving in good cheer, which is medieval code for slightly wobbly. You reach a small wooden desk tucked into the corner. On it, a parchment ledger listing barrels by date and name. Trinity batch, feast brew, healing ale. One line catches your eye. Ladies smile, for the winter fevers. The sisters weren't just making beer, they were customizing it. Adding extra ginger, maybe some honey or elderflower depending on who needed what. And you wonder, how did they learn this? Who taught them which herb soothed a cough, which grain produced more foam, which barrel needed to be turned every third day? The answer, you suspect, is the same as always: the sisterhood. Quiet experimentation, gentle records, long observation, the kind of knowledge you can't buy, only live through. You lean against a cool wall now, eyes fluttering, head filling with the gentle, bubbling rhythm of the fermentation cellar. The convent is hushed again. No one hurries. Nothing clangs. Even the mice seem sleepy. And you, wrapped in this slow ritual of barley and thyme, realize something. Brewing isn't just what these nuns do. It's who they are. It's woven into the rhythm of their prayers, the scent of their robes, the warmth of their halls. A daily miracle lovingly repeated. You wake again, if you ever truly slept, and realize the scent in the air has shifted. Gone is the yeasty sweetness of mash and early fermentation. In its place is something tangier, sharper, but still oddly comforting. The brewing chamber is dim, lit by just a few flickering tapers set in wrought iron sconces. Sister Bertha is nowhere in sight. Instead, you find yourself drawn toward a smaller adjoining room, a kind of cozy apothecary meets madhouse hybrid. Wooden shelves grown under jars of herbs, bundles of dried flowers, and strange little sacks labeled in looping Latin script. One reads calamus, another sambucus. You brush a finger across a dusty jar. Dried orange peel, crisp and curling like forgotten parchment. This is the convent's herb room. And this is where the real alchemy happens. Before hops became the go-to beer stabilizer across Europe, brewers relied on a far more unpredictable and often fiercely guarded set of ingredients known as grut. You mouth the word slowly. Grut isn't one plant, but a wild medley of bittering herbs. Bog myrtle, yarrow, mugwort, wild rosemary, and sometimes, well, no one really agrees. Historians still argue whether the recipes changed seasonally or remained stable over generations. But what's clear is this: medieval nuns were masters of it. Sister Marilda, the convent's unofficial herb witch, and that's your term, not hers, glides silently past you, a copper scoop in one hand, dried herbs in the other. She doesn't speak, but hums under her breath, some half-remembered chant you can't place. As she sprinkles the herbs into a small cloth pouch, you realize this part of the process is practically magical. Not for show, not for theatrics, but because no two brews taste the same, and Marilda makes sure of it. She tucks the gruit into the cooling wort with a reverence normally reserved for holy relics. You watch as the blend swirls gently, transforming the amber liquid into something deeper, more mysterious. The scent sharpens, almost lemony, but then floral, and finally, a faint medicinal tang that reminds you of cold winter nights and grandmother remedies. Interestingly, the nuns didn't just flavor their beer this way for fun. Some of these herbs had serious effects. Mugwort, for example, could induce vivid dreams, or at least that's what the records suggest. Wild rosemary, possibly toxic in high doses. Yarrow, a known wound stopper and fever fighter. Whether the nuns fully understood the biochemical interactions, or just observed results over time, is unclear. But they treated the brewhouse like a pharmacy. And you're standing in the center of it all, like a very sleepy lab assistant with zero credentials. What's more, gruit wasn't just a recipe, it was a source of tension. Secular authorities, bishops, even kings occasionally tried to tax or control the right to make it. In some regions, a gruit right gave specific religious institutions monopoly access to the needed herbs, turning the beer trade into political theater. There are whispered stories, tucked into the footnotes of dusty church records, of nuns accidentally cultivating outlawed herbs or misplacing permits. Let's just say Sister Marilda knows where the bodies aren't buried. You wander toward a wooden bench, trailing your fingers across bundles of herbs suspended from the beams. There's lavender for calming the nerves, sage for purification, a little mint for clarity. Brewing, you realize, wasn't just nourishment, it was a kind of herbal therapy doled out in mugs. And just when you think this herbal dreamscape couldn't get more enchanting, Sister Marilda turns to a second pot, this one much smaller. She ladles out a bit of the gruit-infused wort and pours it into a stoneware cup. No ceremony, no bells, just a knowing look. You lift it to your lips. Tastes confusing. There's the sweetness of malt, yes, but it's layered under something wild and sharp. Bitter, but not unpleasant. The aftertaste lingers like clover and cracked pepper. You're not sure whether you're drinking medicine, beer, or tea. Marilda watches with an amused eyebrow. You nod slowly, dazedly. She chuckles softly and turns back to her jars. There's a debate among scholars, of course there is, about how much autonomy brewing nuns had. Some suggest they had to defer to male clergy for recipe approval. Others argue, with convincing evidence, that once the beer was brewing, the convent was in full command. You suspect the truth lies somewhere in between, flavored by geography, politics, and the sheer stubbornness of the sisters. What's undeniable, however, is that nuns carved out their own space within the church's rigid hierarchy. Through their brews, they funded hospitals, fed the poor, and maybe, just maybe, swayed a bishop or two with a particularly well-aged cask. Outside, night presses more firmly against the convent walls. Rain begins to patter on the slate roof, soft and rhythmic. You're still sitting beside the herb bench, legs warm, head full of brew-scented fog. In the corner, a novice is carefully copying a recipe onto parchment. She frowns, pauses, then dips her quill again. You notice she's writing from memory, not reference. The brewing knowledge is being passed on line by fragrant line. Before you drift off again, you make out a final shelf, tucked behind the others. On it, a few small stone bottles sealed with wax. Tinctures, perhaps, or maybe something stronger. The nuns keep their secrets well. And you? You breathe deep, the scent of mugwort and roasted grain threading through your dreams, and let yourself sink once more into the slow, amber tide of monastic brewing. You wake to the sound of soft, rhythmic clinking, wooden paddles knocking gently against copper vats. The brewing room is humming again, though now the nuns have taken on a quieter energy. The sun has begun its lazy climb over the cloister walls, spilling drowsy light through the arched windows, catching on the steam curling up from a freshly scrubbed floor. Someone is humming a hymn in Latin, or possibly just improvising the melody, hard to tell. You stretch your legs, brushing malt dust from your tunic, or wait, Were you wearing a tunic? No matter. The important thing is that today is bottling day. Or rather, barreling day. You shuffle behind Sister Genevieve, who smells faintly of sandalwood and has the hunched posture of someone who's been carrying casks longer than you've been alive. She's leading you to the coldest part of the cellar. Now, it's easy to assume that in the Middle Ages, storing beer was some rudimentary affair. Big barrels, dark corners, hope for the best. But in reality, these nuns had surprisingly advanced methods for preserving their brews. In this particular convent, nestled in the foothills of what we now call the Rhineland, they've developed their own system of clay-lined fermentation vessels, cool air vents carved into stone, and a rotation schedule so finely tuned it rivals modern breweries. You trail your fingers along the rim of one open cask. Inside, the beer is gently bubbling, fermentation still at work. The scent here is sharper, yeastier, and tinged with that earthy tang you now associate with Sister Marilda's herb blend. You notice the lids stacked nearby, each carved with a small sigil, not just to label, but to protect. Beer, after all, is a living thing and in some convents a sacred one, which leads you to an unexpected discovery. Tucked into a worn corner of the cellar, there's a small alcove, almost like a shrine. Candles, some melted flat with age, surround a carved wooden statue of Saint Bridget. She's holding, is that a mug? Yes, a wooden cup raised in blessing. Turns out, Saint Bridget of Kildare, beloved by many nuns, was also the unofficial patron of brewing. According to one cheerful legend, she once turned her bathwater into beer for thirsty lepers. Historians still argue whether such stories were symbolic, exaggerated, or the result of translation errors. But the affection for her in brewing convents was very real. Her feast day was often celebrated with special casks, often with a slightly sweeter brew than usual, a kind of ecclesiastical happy hour. And this little alcove is not just for decoration. Sister Genevieve crosses herself before placing the sealed barrel beneath Bridget's watchful gaze. You do the same, mostly out of peer pressure. Now here's a curious tidbit. While monks are famously associated with brewing, many early beer innovations actually came from nuns. There's scattered evidence, letters, ledger notes, even graffiti in abbey margins that suggests women religious were experimenting with batch sizes, ingredients, and preservation methods well ahead of their monthly counterparts. In fact, some of the earliest recorded instances of boiling beer to stabilize it come from convent records, not monasteries. You glance toward a tiny window cut into the stone. Cool air seeps through, hitting your cheeks. This passive cooling system is just one of the clever tricks these women used. Without modern refrigeration, controlling fermentation temperature was essential, and they did it with underground chambers, shaded courtyards, and schedule rotations timed to the seasons. Frankly, if they'd been given more funding and fewer ecclesiastical rules, they might have invented lagers centuries earlier. Another monk-friendly myth shattered. You watch as the nuns begin labeling the barrels. Not with modern branding, of course, no cheeky logos or mascots, but rather with symbols. A star for holy days, a fish for Lenten brew, a tiny snail for slow-aged, which is either a reference to the maturation process or to Sister Genevieve's legendary pace. No one is quite sure. And then there's the X mark. That one catches your eye. You point to it and one of the younger sisters, Sister Imelda, maybe 16, cheeks still round and voice like a whisper, giggles softly. That one, she explains, is the watch yourself batch. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's strong enough to make even the abbot blush. She says this with the straightest face imaginable. You make a mental note to find that barrel later. There's also a debate, Imelda tells you, over how much beer the nuns actually drank themselves. Some sources claim they were allowed just a cup or two per day, strictly rationed, of course. Others suggest that during fasting seasons, when solid food was prohibited, beer was essentially a meal replacement. And if your meal was particularly well brewed, well, you might go back for seconds. Or thirds. Imelda shrugs, eyes twinkling. God understands, she whispers, and skips off down the corridor. It's easy to forget that these nuns weren't just beer makers. They were chemists, managers, laborers, and occasionally quiet rebels. The brewing operation wasn't a side hustle. It was essential. It funded their orphanages, supplied their hospitals, and cemented their place in a society that often saw women, even holy women, as background characters. You lean back against a barrel marked with the fish symbol. The air smells faintly of lavender, iron, and roasted grain. Somewhere above, a bell tolls the hour. Below, the beer rests, alive, fermenting, awaiting its moment. And all around you, the nuns move in silence, laughter, and purpose, each step another stanza in a centuries-long brewing hymn. You close your eyes, listening to the rhythmic shuffle of footsteps and the faint gurgle of fermentation. There's something eternal about it. This patient waiting, this care and craftsmanship, this belief that even a humble beverage can be sacred if made with enough love. And maybe just a little mugwort. The cellar lingers behind you like a deep breath held too long, cool and shadowed, scented with oak and herbs. As you step into the upper corridor, light filters through narrow stained glass slits, casting soft swirls of amber and blue across the floor. It's easy to forget you're in a place that's part holy sanctuary, part industrial brewing operation. But then, a nun walks by with a stack of ledgers nearly as tall as her, muttering something about barley weights and the bishop's absurd tax again. And the illusion slips away, because if there's one thing medieval nuns were just as committed to as prayer and piety, it was paperwork. Today, you're headed to the scriptorium. Not to copy scriptures, no. You're here to witness a different kind of divine labor, the brewing records. You expect something informal, maybe doodled margins and guesswork numbers. What you find instead is a masterclass in medieval logistics. Sister Theodrata greets you with a quill tucked behind one ear and ink-stained fingers. She doesn't look up as she flips through parchment after parchment of brewing entries, her expression unreadable save for the occasional twitch of her eyebrow whenever she spots a miscalculation. The scriptorium is silent except for the soft scratch of quills and the occasional sigh of someone grappling with Latin math. Here, brewing is a science. Every bushel of malted barley, every scoop of dried yarrow, every hour of fermentation, documented, balanced, and cross-referenced. The nuns even track how certain herbs affect the shelf life, taste, and, occasionally, the temperaments of the visiting monks. One note, you notice, simply reads, "Too much tansy." Father Ulrich sang until matins. But it's not just meticulous bookkeeping that makes these records fascinating. It's the way they blur the lines between sacred duty and subtle rebellion. Historians still argue whether these brewing logs were officially sanctioned by church authorities or quietly tolerated. Brewing wasn't always welcomed as a religious pursuit, especially for women. Some bishops believed nuns should be praying, not peddling pints. But others, seeing the profits flow in and the local sick cared for with the proceeds, looked the other way. And so the scriptorium became both sanctuary and strategy room. You lean closer to one set of entries marked with an odd zigzag. Sister Theodrata explains, without looking up, that it's the convent's internal code for a swap batch. When grain was scarce or the taxman too greedy, they'd mix in root vegetables or acorns, sometimes even dried peas. The result was not always pleasant. One line reads, "Taste, penitential. Likely Lenten use only." A soft chuckle rises from the far desk. Another sister waves a parchment at you. "This one's from the frost year," she says. "Had to brew with what we could find." One nun swore adding roasted chestnuts would make it taste like heaven. It didn't. But even in failure, they documented everything. There's a real sense here that brewing wasn't just a chore. It was an intellectual pursuit. Recipes were tested, theories debated. One entry from the late 1100s speculates that soaking malt longer might create a smoother flavor, though another marginal note argues that smoother isn't holier. In the margins, someone has drawn a frowning barley stalk. Even more fascinating, the sisters seem to have conducted taste tests. There's a recurring phrase in the margins, "satis dulcis," or "sweet enough," followed by cryptic notes like, "Sister Petra disagrees, but she always does." One page has a list of brew strength rankings, accompanied by tiny faces, some smiling, some faintly nauseous. Among all this precision, you spot something stranger. A list of dreams. Yes, actual nighttime dreams. Apparently, once a month, the nuns shared what they dreamed after drinking a particular brew. Most are mundane visions of gardens, babies, wandering donkeys, but a few are oddly mystical. One describes a choir of birds that sing psalms. Another, a fish speaks and offers advice on barley. Theologians may scoff, but here in the convent, dreams matter. They're little signs from God, or maybe just warnings not to overdo the mugwort. You realize then that brewing wasn't separate from spiritual life, it was interwoven. Just as psalms were sung to calm the mind, the act of grinding grain and boiling wort was also a prayer of sorts. A way to serve, a way to contribute, a way to quietly assert value in a world that didn't always value them. One parchment, yellowed with age, simply reads, "Brewed for the orphan's table. May it bring strength." It's not grand, it's not poetic, but it carries weight. And let's not forget, money mattered too. The convent brewed not just for themselves, but for pilgrims, travelers, and occasionally the bishop's feasts. They charged modestly, yes, but consistently, and that meant income, which meant autonomy, which for medieval women was rare and precious. Still, scholars debate whether this economic freedom gave nuns true independence. Were they empowered, or just tolerated as long as the coin kept flowing? Did the church support their skill or simply exploit it? No easy answers, but the ledgers don't lie. And as Sister Theodrata finally looks up, just once, to say, "Don't touch the ink, it bites," you realize that for all their quiet demeanor, these nuns were running an empire, not with swords or sermons, but with yeast, grain, and fiercely accurate math. You step away, the soft crackle of parchment still echoing in your ears. As you pass back into the hallway, you can hear the distant hum of brewing again. Murmured prayers, the clink of tools, the heartbeat of the convent continuing on. You glance back toward the scriptorium door, now closed. You'll dream of numbers tonight, of curled ink and barley equations, and of a group of women who brewed not just beer, but a quiet kind of revolution. Outside, the garden path crunches softly under your feet. The afternoon sun dapples through the fig trees, casting shadows like lace across the packed earth. A few bees hover lazily around the lavender patch, and somewhere nearby, a hen is making a dramatic fuss over absolutely nothing. You pause at a small wooden bench tucked beneath a crooked pear tree. From here, you can see the low stone buildings of the convent brewery, modest in scale, but bustling with life and purpose. Today, you're heading to a quieter corner of this operation, the herbarium. This is where the nuns experiment. You'd think beer would be a straightforward affair, water, grain, maybe some hops if you're lucky, but not here. Not with these sisters. Here, brewing is closer to alchemy. The herbarium is both garden and lab. Rows of raised beds contain not just common brewing herbs like groot, yarrow, and bog myrtle, but also stranger flora, wormwood, anise, sweet woodruff, all meticulously labeled in neat Latin and vernacular. Sister Gertrudis, who runs the place, greets you with dirt on her nose and a grin that suggests she hasn't had a nap since Epiphany. She hands you a small pouch. "Smell this," she says. "This mugwort, bitter, almost metallic. Good for dreams," she adds, then winks. "Or nightmares. Depends who drinks it." This is the kind of herbal knowledge that nuns passed from generation to generation. Not written down in official records, but murmured over simmering pots and shared during evening walks. Brewing wasn't just about alcohol, it was medicine, mood, and mystery. Historians still argue whether the use of herbs in convent brewing was intentional or just accidental preservation of older folk traditions. Some claim the nuns drew on ancient Roman and pre-Christian recipes. Others believe it was born from necessity. After all, hops were expensive and not always available, especially in isolated regions. So the sisters turned to their gardens and their memories. You follow Sister Gertrudis as she points out her favorites. Sweet Gale keeps the beer light and heady. Meadowsweet smells divine but spoils fast in heat. And this, she gestures to a spiky cluster of dried catmint, makes everyone very cheerful, sometimes too cheerful. She tells you stories as she works, how they once added rosemary to a celebratory batch and half the convent claimed visions of flying angels or indigestion. It was never confirmed. How the bishop forbade wormwood after an unfortunate bout of ecstatic poetry in the novices' dormitory. And how, on especially cold nights, they'd sneak a little extra ginger into the brew to warm the soul. You're beginning to understand that flavor wasn't the only goal. The herbs chosen often had symbolic meaning. Juniper for protection, sage for wisdom, marjoram for peace. Brewing became a form of coded prayer, drinkable blessings tucked into every cup. But this experimentation came with risks. Some batches turned out unpalatable. Others, unpredictably strong. One legendary brew, the Michaelmas Special, was so potent that it caused two sisters to miss an entire day of prayers and claim they'd met Saint Bridget in the stable. Records note that the recipe was set aside for festivals only. Still, the sisters kept at it. Their knowledge wasn't static, it evolved. You see evidence of this in a weathered leather-bound book Sister Gertrudis lets you peek into. It's not quite a grimoire, but it flirts with the idea. Annotated recipes, notes on boiling times, comments on taste, potency, and peculiar side effects. Some pages are marked with little skulls, mostly decorative, you hope. One is simply labeled "Never Again." Yet what's striking is the precision. They tested, tasted, adjusted. These were no amateurs playing with herbs, they were scientists in habits. Quiet innovators in a world that didn't expect women to innovate at all. You wonder aloud how they knew what worked. Sister Gertrudis just laughs. Trial, error, and prayer, she says. A lot of prayer. A breeze stirs the herb beds, releasing a sleepy perfume into the air. You breathe it in, clary sage, lemon balm, maybe a hint of elderflower, and feel suddenly very drowsy. No wonder the sisters always looked serene. As you sit beneath the pear tree again, watching the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional flutter of a bird in the branches, it occurs to you that this part of the convent, the fragrant, whispered, deeply feminine science of brewing, might be its quietest act of rebellion, a reclaiming of knowledge, a weaving of spiritual care into something utterly physical. Historians debate how much of this was intentional empowerment versus simple survival. Did the nuns know they were subverting gender roles by excelling at what was largely a male-dominated craft? Or were they just doing what needed to be done, instinctively folding care, competence, and creativity into every ale-stained recipe? Hard to say, and maybe it doesn't matter, because here, in this fragrant corner of the world, the beer wasn't just beer. It was a potion of peace, a brew of benevolence, a quiet testament to what happened when women were given time, tools, and just enough freedom to experiment. You hear the bell for Vespers toll in the distance. Time slips softly forward, like malt steeping in warm water. You rise, brush herb crumbs from your lap, and smile. You'll dream sweet tonight. You slip back inside, just as the shadows lengthen across the courtyard and a light mist begins to gather over the stone walls. The evening bell has already rung, and supper is done. Simple fare you'd imagine. Maybe lentil stew with a heel of brown bread, and just a spoonful of that last batch of plum conserve that everyone's been pretending to forget about. The air is cooler now, tinged with damp earth, old wood, and the faint yeasty perfume that's become the backdrop to your time here. Tonight, you're heading to the brewing cellars. Not for work, though. For storage and secrets. Most convent breweries kept their barrels below ground, not only to control temperature but also to keep them undisturbed, away from light, mice, and the occasional overenthusiastic novice. You descend a steep stone stairwell, running your hand along the cool, pocked wall, until you reach a low, vaulted chamber. Rows of barrels stretch out before you like sleeping giants. Candlelight flickers along their rounded flanks, casting distorted halos on the curved ceiling. Here, Sister Apollonia keeps watch. She's older, soft-spoken, and moves like someone who remembers a time before the abbess was born. She's already waiting for you, sitting on a stool with a worn cloth in her lap, polishing a set of tasting ladles like they're relics. "Mind your head," she murmurs, gesturing toward a beam that looks exactly the right height to ruin your evening. You duck, barely. This part of the convent is quiet. Too quiet, and yet somehow alive. The barrels creak faintly. Somewhere something drips. You can almost hear the beer breathing. Sister Apollonia gestures to a small barrel tucked in the corner. "That one's from the St. Catherine's feast batch," she says. "Too much coriander." Some of the sisters liked it, but I think it tastes like soap. She pulls out a narrow wooden plug from the top of another cask and dips a ladle in. You take a sip. It's cool, earthy, a little sour. Not bad, but not quite like anything you've had before. She watches your face and smirks. We call that one the abbess's regret. She insisted on wild yeast. Never again. The thing is, brewing at scale, even small convent scale, isn't easy. Fermentation is a finicky process. A batch might be perfect 1 week and undrinkable the next. Temperature, humidity, barrel condition, the mood of the yeast, all could influence the final product. And because nuns weren't always allowed access to the same resources as monks, they often had to get creative. Some records suggest they repurposed old wine casks, clay amphorae, and even reused sheep bladders as strainers. Historians still argue whether these improvisations led to uniquely flavored beers or were simply health hazards with holy branding. Either way, the nuns drank them. More interesting, though, is what they did with the surplus. Yes, beer was made for the sisters, for guests, and sometimes for nearby parishes. But occasionally, there was extra. And here's where things get a little hush-hush. Because, strictly speaking, nuns weren't supposed to sell beer commercially. That was often reserved for male monasteries. And yet, some convents found clever ways around that little restriction. Sister Apollonia leans in conspiratorially. A few barrels went missing once, she says. Found their way into a merchant's wagon. And the merchant? He found his way into our chapel donation box. She raises an eyebrow. Miraculous, really? These whispered arrangements weren't always about money. Sometimes it was barter. A cask of strong ale in exchange for new linens, or exotic spices from a passing trader. One particularly bold convent in Flanders was rumored to trade their signature brew for fresh Italian lemons each spring. And you better believe they put those lemons to good use. Of course, there were risks. Not all abbesses approved. And the local bishop? He was usually of two minds, unofficially impressed, officially scandalized. Records exist of warnings issued to convents for improper commerce and unladylike ambition. But enforcement was sporadic. After all, what bishop wants to be known as the man who shut down the nuns' beer? It's possible that some of the most famous medieval Alesh weren't from monks at all, but from these shadowy corners, aged in cool cellars under silent stone. You ask Sister Apollonia how much of this is true, and she just shrugs. Depends who's asking. She lights another candle and begins to wipe down a dusty bottle in the far corner. Hand-blown glass, sealed with wax, and labeled in a script so old it looks like it belongs in a museum. We only open these on Jubilee years, she says. Or if the abbess has a really bad day. You wonder what forgotten recipes lie sealed in glass down here. Beer aged for decades, infused with herbs no longer grown. Forgotten techniques. Tastes no one's tongue remembers. It's like stepping into a time capsule that smells faintly of cloves and damp oak. And here's a thought. If a convent barrel rolled out of sight, and no one was around to see it, did it become a sin? Or just an excellent vintage? Historians debate whether these quiet cellar dealings were widespread or rare exceptions. But what they all agree on is this. Nuns knew what they were doing. These weren't happy accidents. This was controlled craft, sometimes disguised, sometimes denied, but always present. The candle flickers, the cellar sighs, and Sister Apollonia smiles at you with the calm of someone who has outlived every rulebook. You thank her, bow your head to avoid the beam again, and begin the slow climb back to the world above. Your legs are a bit heavier now. Maybe it's the stairs. Maybe it's the ale. Either way, the evening has shifted into that peculiar stillness where stories settle like dust, and truth blends quietly into legend. You emerge from the cellar with a soft creak of the door behind you, stepping back into the stone hallway where the scent of old yeast fades into cool, damp stone and faint traces of lavender oil. The night has truly set in now. Outside, the last of the golden sky has slipped into indigo, and the distant hoot of an owl tells you that even the mice are making smarter decisions than you, wandering around at this hour. You pass a group of novices murmuring evening prayers in the chapel alcove, their voices like water gently trickling over old stone. And for a moment, everything feels still, timeless, suspended in the hush that wraps medieval life like a woolen cloak. But you've got one more stop tonight, the convent's herbarium. Now, you wouldn't normally associate herbs with brewing, unless you've had one of those aggressively botanical IPAs that taste like someone soaked a pine cone in gin. But medieval nuns? Oh, they were herb geniuses. Their gardens were laboratories, pharmacies, pantries, and yes, breweries. You ease open the wooden gate and step into the small courtyard garden. It's dark, but you can still make out neat rows of plants, carefully labeled with wooden tags. Chamomile, marjoram, hyssop, bog myrtle, some of them more useful than tasty. A cat slinks between the hedges like it owns the place, probably because it does. You nod to it. It ignores you. In the far corner, under a canvas awning strung with drying bundles of herbs, Sister Ludwiga is at work. She's tall, all elbows and stern glances, and currently grinding something that smells faintly of citrus and dust. Juniper, she mutters before you ask. Makes the beer cleaner. Cuts the funk. You'd heard that before. Many convent brewers were also apothecaries. The line between beer and medicine was often blurry. Hops, which we now think of as essential to beer, weren't always used. In fact, they were controversial. Monks liked them because they preserved beer longer and added a bitter tang. Nuns, on the other hand, sometimes preferred the older herb mixtures called grut, which could include anything from yarrow to mugwort to, well, things that probably shouldn't have been in a beverage. Historians still argue whether the choice of herbs reflected taste or theology, Sister Ludwiga says without looking up. But we all know it was mostly just what grew well in the garden. And it's true, herbal gruts were hyperlocal, based on what the soil and seasons allowed. One convent's beer might be sharp with rosemary and thyme, while another's tasted of sweet gale and sage. Some batches were intentionally calming, lavender, chamomile, especially for the elderly sisters or during Lent. Others were stimulating. There's a record of one Polish abbey that made vigorous brew for long night vigils. The recipe included pepper, cinnamon, and something that may or may not have been ground-up beetles. Details are fuzzy and hopefully extinct. Sister Ludwiga gestures to a low wooden table covered in parchment scraps and hand-inked sketches. These are recipe records, not neatly kept, mind you. Just clusters of notes, half in Latin, half in that distinctly hard-to-read nun cursive, with little side comments like less lemon balm this time or Sister Gertrude's rash, never again. You run your fingers along the margins of one. A little ink sketch shows a smiling sun and, below it, a frothy mug. That's one of mine, she says. Only for feast days, not for penance. One of the reasons these herbal blends were so prized was because they gave nuns control not just over the flavor but the mood. Remember, these were cloistered communities. Life was predictable, rhythmic. A well-timed, gently spiced beer wasn't just a drink. It was a moment of variation, a shift in tone, something unexpected in a world where surprises were few and often unwelcome. And it wasn't just internal use either. Some convents were known to provide healing beers to the local community. Low-alcohol, herbal-infused brews that were closer to tinctures. They claimed to ease digestion, calm the nerves, and even assist in marital cooperation. We'll let you interpret that however you like. Not everything was about flavor, Sister Ludwiga adds, tucking a wisp of gray hair back under her veil. Some of these herbs were prayers in plant form, which is oddly beautiful when you think about it. That every cup brewed wasn't just sustenance or routine, but intention. A sip that held meaning beyond the palate. She lifts a clay pot and offers you a whiff. It's pungent, sharp, and earthy. For winter Alish, she says. Warms the belly and the soul. Also clears the sinuses. You cough a little. She grins. As you look around the garden, the intertwining of brewing and botany becomes clearer. Here's the culinary arm of theology. Taste as metaphor, spice as virtue, bitter as a reminder that even joy should be tempered. The nuns didn't just make beer. They infused it with worldview. And that's something that modern microbreweries, with their ironic names and limited batches, might appreciate more than they know. Because for all our stainless steel and temperature controls, we're still chasing the same thing these nuns were. A drink that tells a story, that anchors us in a place and a moment and a feeling. You glance back at the drying bundles, sage and savory, perhaps something more mysterious, and wonder which brew those will become next. Maybe something celebratory. Maybe something contemplative. Or maybe just something to sip slowly while watching the first snow of December fall past the convent window. The cat reappears and brushes your leg, unimpressed by your musings. Sister Ludwiga chuckles. She only comes around when it's almost midnight, and with that, you step out of the herbarium, leaving behind a world of dried petals, ancient recipes, and whispers in the scent of time. You return to the cloister walk, your shoes softly brushing the worn flagstones, the herbal scent still clinging faintly to your robe like a souvenir from another world. The convent is quieter now. The bells have long stopped tolling, and the hum of communal prayers has faded to a silence so complete you can hear your own breath echo against the walls. Somewhere behind a shuttered window, someone's snoring gently. It's probably Sister Margarita. You're told her nighttime rumblings are legendary, capable of rattling pews. You drift past the refectory and duck into a smaller chamber, candlelit and cozy, where 3 older nuns are seated around a large ledger. Their faces are drawn but kind, brows furrowed in what looks like the quiet intensity of accounting. You've just stumbled upon something crucial, something that separates the decent brewers from the remarkable ones. The brewing logs. Medieval brewing wasn't just about intuition. It was also about record-keeping, in an age where ink was precious and parchment didn't grow on trees. Well, it sort of did, but you know what we mean. These brewing records were the secret weapons of the nuns. They weren't merely noting ingredients, they were documenting weather, fermentation days, water clarity, batch sizes, the mood of the yeast, and, occasionally, whether Sister Agnes had sneezed in the word again. One of the nuns notices you and smiles, sliding the ledger your way. It's older than the convent cat, the leather brittle and cracking at the corners, but it opens like it's been used every week for 2 centuries. Inside, the handwriting changes with every few pages. Some neat and angular, others sprawling and a little dramatic, like the author was writing with flair and flourishes between baking loaves or translating psalms. You trace a line with your finger. 3rd batch this Lent, too cloudy, possibly due to low barley roasting. Sister Alma says it's the cursed wind. Classic Alma, blaming the breeze. Another entry, this one accented with a tiny sketch of a loaf of bread. Paired this ale with rye biscuits, caused hiccups in choir rehearsal. Reduce honey. These records weren't just recipes, they were living journals of brewing as daily life. The kinds of notes you'd scribble on your fridge today, don't buy that almond milk again, or add more chili next time, but not that much. But in this case, it's about how best to ferment barley in a cold drafty room where the walls weep with condensation and the firewood is damp. It gets more interesting the deeper you go. There's an entire section devoted to what the convent called seasonal deviations. Brewing, after all, is notoriously temperamental, and medieval tools weren't exactly precision instruments. A summer ale fermented too long might get sour. A winter batch might barely ferment at all. Some nuns took it upon themselves to become weather watchers, reading the sky, charting the stars, even praying to particular saints for ideal brewing conditions. One note reads, Feast of St. Cuthbert, skies clear, barley plump, favorable for tomorrow's mash. Historians still argue whether these logs represent science or superstition. Was it empirical observation, a primitive form of meteorology, or just a convent full of women determined to blame their brewing fails on a grumpy celestial patron? But for you, reading these entries by flickering candlelight, they feel like something else entirely. Stubborn, precise love. Brewing wasn't just a chore. It was an art, a science, and most importantly, a form of devotion. These women recorded every nuance not because they were obligated to, but because they cared deeply about the result. Not for ego, not for commerce, but for community. You ask softly if any of these logs were ever shared with the outside world. One of the sisters raises an eyebrow like you just asked if they give away their best bread recipe. Some were, she finally replies, but most stayed here. This is family history, and truly it is. The margin notes hint at jokes you'll never understand. Don't let Sister Emma near the fermenter again, one entry warns. Was she clumsy? Curious? Prone to confusing buckets? Another line simply says, Frothy miracle today, no explanation. Make of that what you will. Occasionally, they experimented. That's right, medieval nuns were tinkerers. There are side sections where someone tried brewing with chestnuts instead of grain. Another tested honey infusion techniques. Too sweet, the verdict scrawled beside it. Sister Hildegard called it syrup of sin. You can't help but laugh a little at that, which draws another amused glance from the nuns. One of them shrugs. We don't brew like that anymore, of course. Not since the abbess declared the syrup experiment unholy. It's worth noting that beer wasn't always the endgame. Sometimes the process was the point. Long fermentation days could be contemplative, rhythmic, spiritual. Like prayer, but with a thermometer. Well, if they'd had thermometers. What they had instead was instinct, observation, and a near-mystical sense of timing passed down nun to nun. In the back pages, you find a rare oddity. A small map of the brewing cellar, drawn with playful inaccuracy. One corner is labeled Haunted by Brother Francis. Even though, technically, there were no brothers in this convent. Unless they meant the occasional monk visitor. Or maybe a rat with a certain swagger. Beside that sketch, a final entry in a different hand, likely more modern. May our sisters' brews live on, in taste, in memory, and in joy. You close the book carefully, suddenly aware of how much history you're holding. Not the grand battles and kings sort of history, but something quieter, homelier, and in many ways more honest. These weren't women setting out to be legends. They were caretakers of routines, of flavor, of care. Their legacy isn't statues or cathedrals, but perhaps a perfectly balanced ale on a cold evening, or the memory of a good joke scribbled beside a recipe for beer that once made the whole convent giggle. As you stand and stretch, the candles flicker, as if the room itself exhales. You thank the sisters and step out into the hallway once more. The air feels cooler now, touched with the faint scent of barley and ink. And just like that, you continue your journey deeper into the lives of these quietly remarkable brewers of the cloth. You follow the stone corridor until the air thickens again with warmth and an unmistakable yeasty tang that rises up and kisses your nose like sourdough in mid-prove. The brewing chamber, yes, the brewing chamber, is tucked behind a heavy wooden door that creaks open with the drama of a church confession. It's dim in here, but inviting, with flickers of firelight dancing on copper kettles and large barrels stained from decades of devotion. You've officially entered the heart of convent brewing. And make no mistake, this is not some rustic side project. This is a full-blown operation. You blink slowly, adjusting to the amberlit space, and realize just how serious the sisters are about their craft. Barrels are neatly aligned, kettles gleam, as much as anything medieval ever gleamed. And everything smells faintly like warm cereal and old prayers. You half expect a choir of yeast cells to burst into Latin chant. One sister waves you over to the mash tun, where a bubbling, porridge-like mixture releases steam in gentle clouds. This is the mash, the first real stage of the beer-making ritual. Crushed malted grains mixed with hot water to convert starches into sugar. You lean in, and it's like peering into a cauldron of comfort. The scent alone could probably cure seasonal depression. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval mash tuns, like the one you're staring into now, were often made of wood or clay, and maintaining consistent heat was a challenge. Hence the sister hovering nearby, gently stirring the contents with a carved paddle the size of a canoe. Or she looks serene, almost smug. She's clearly mastered the patience and wrist strength of a pro. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Ever heard of the bishop's finger test? Before thermometers, brewers would dip a clean finger, often a bishop's or more likely just someone important, into the mash. If it was too hot to hold there comfortably, it needed cooling. Not exactly FDA approved, but effective-ish. And yes, the irony of nuns using a bishop's imaginary finger to measure temperature is not lost on anyone. You ask, half-jokingly, if they still use that method. The sister smiles. Only when we want to blame someone else for burning the mash. The process is both sacred and bodily. You stir, you strain, you lift heavy sacks of grain and dump them with care. Every nun in here is involved. Brewing wasn't a hobby, it was a full-body sacrament. Even novices took part, often learning through whispered instruction or a stern glance that said, "No, Don't touch that valve unless you want the whole place to smell like socks. You move to the boiling kettle where the liquid, now called wort, is simmering with purpose. Hops, or sometimes local herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow, are added here. The aroma is sharper now, more medicinal, less porridge, and more earthy spice. This step sterilizes the brew and adds flavor and bitterness. Medieval nuns didn't always have hops available, especially early on, so they used what they could forage. The convent garden likely looked less like an herb plot and more like a magical apothecary that occasionally exploded. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how much autonomy these women truly had in crafting and modifying their beer. Some historians argue they were limited to women's tasks, confined to repeating inherited recipes without innovation. Others suggest the opposite, that convents, being self-contained and often relatively wealthy, gave nuns surprising freedom to experiment. After all, if you control the ingredients, the tools, and the distribution, who's stopping you from sneaking in a bit of elderflower just to see what happens? You watch one sister sprinkle something into a smaller vessel. When you ask, she says simply, "Secret." That's the thing. Many convents developed their own regional flavor, their signature taste. No two batches alike, and no two convents agreed on the perfect profile. Light, dark, bitter, fruity. Convent Alesh were as varied as the sisters who brewed them. At the far end of the room, a novice is ladling cooled wort into a tall container, readying it for fermentation. You peer inside, and the sticky, warm sweetness clings to the sides like molasses. It smells like breakfast, dessert, and a brisk walk through a barley field all at once. Then comes the yeast. In this era, yeast was less added and more welcomed. They didn't know the science, but they knew the magic. Convents had special wooden paddles or fermenting vats that harbored friendly wild yeasts, passed down like family heirlooms. If you cleaned them too well, you risked losing the entire character of the beer. So, ironically, a little filth preserved tradition. A sister hands you a lidded crock with reverence, whispering, "Starter." You nod solemnly. You have no idea what to do with it, but it feels important, like you've been entrusted with a living relic, something between a sourdough mother and the Holy Grail. You linger as the room quiets down, the brewing mostly done, the mash tun empty, the barrels sealed. There's a sense of pride here, but it's quiet, not showy. The kind of satisfaction that comes from doing something well and knowing that very few people outside these walls will ever understand how much went into it. It's not just beer. It's not even just devotion. It's continuity, a recipe stirred by hundreds of hands. A taste shaped by memory, faith, and weather. You're standing in the center of a centuries-old time loop, where barley and water and hope are combined in the exact same way they've always been, and somehow it still matters. You thank the sisters and turn back toward the corridor. The scent of hops trails you like perfume. Somewhere deep inside you, a very modern part of your brain whispers that you'd pay $12 for this in a microbrewery, and you wouldn't even complain. And then, as you close the door behind you, another thought nudges you awake. You're not even halfway through the day yet. You step back into the corridor, the scent of ale still clinging to your clothes like a whispered benediction. The stone underfoot feels cooler now, or maybe it's just your body coming down from the warmth of the brewing room. You move forward through a quieter part of the convent, past a cloister garden where lavender nods sleepily in the breeze, and toward another hum of activity. Less steamy, more rhythmic. You follow it like a sleepwalker drawn to a lullaby. You duck under an arched doorway into a room filled with tapping sounds and hushed conversation. This is the bottling and storing space, a dry chamber with shelves stacked high with glazed jugs, wooden casks, and, oddly, small scrolls of parchment labeled in delicate, looping Latin. These nuns weren't just brewing. They were tracking every batch like accountants of fermentation. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Monastic record-keeping was often meticulous, even for the more domestic tasks. Brew logs, quantities, dates, and comments on taste or quality were sometimes written down, especially in wealthier convents. While few of these specific ale records survive from nunneries, similar ones from male monasteries give us strong clues that the sisters likely did the same. One record you pass notes a batch as weaker than usual, but good for feast days. Another has only one ominous word: exploded. You don't ask. You watch as a sister seals a stoneware jug with beeswax, tilting it gently before setting it among dozens of others. The labeling process is neat, almost reverent. She's humming, off-key but soothing, and the song feels older than the building. You notice that each batch has a different colored ribbon around the neck, perhaps to distinguish recipes, or fermentation dates, or maybe just personal flair. Historians still argue whether these color codes were purely functional or symbolic, with some suggesting they denoted liturgical calendar use or medicinal strength. Others think the ribbons were just a sister's way of flexing her creative muscle. You reach for a jug labeled with a tiny drawing of a fish fasting beer. Yes, the medieval church allowed beer during fasting, and in some places it was encouraged. Liquid wasn't considered a violation of fasting rules, so if you were on a Lenten fast, your best bet for calories might be a hearty liquid bread ale. Nuns were adept at adjusting recipes accordingly, thicker, stronger, sometimes even spiced for extra energy. No offense to modern meal replacement shakes, but medieval nuns were way ahead of you. And here's the fringe tidbit of this chapter. Some convents brewed special alesh specifically for medicinal purposes, beers infused with herbs like sage, wormwood, or rosemary. These brews weren't made for pleasure but for healing. Think of it like a pint of NyQuil with holy water. And no, you won't find that in your local pub. You take a seat on an overturned barrel, watching as two novices argue gently over corking technique. The older sister supervising doesn't intervene. She just lets them bicker. You get the feeling the beer will be fine either way. But the lesson in patience? That's what she's really after. The storage room also houses failed experiments. Moldy casks, cracked pots, spoiled wort that smells like gym socks. There's a surprising amount of failure in this process, even for experts. But no one here seems ashamed of it. The nuns catalog even their failures with the same care as their successes, as if every mistake is just another footnote in their pursuit of perfection. You trail a sister into a connected chamber, the distribution area. This is where the beer leaves the convent walls. Large carts with barrels line the perimeter. Delivery routes were essential to a nunnery's income. Some convents sold their beer to surrounding villages, merchants, or even clergy. You're standing in the medieval equivalent of a loading dock. There's another scholarly debate that threads through this room like a draft. How much of the profits from convent brewing actually stayed with the nuns? Some argue they had control over earnings and reinvested them into convent life. Clothing, manuscript copying, better gardens. Others believe church oversight, usually male bishops, often siphoned off the income, leaving sisters with barely enough to maintain operations. In either case, brewing wasn't just sacred work, it was economic work. Necessary, strategic, and possibly the only way some nunneries avoided ruin. A novice rolls a small barrel toward the exit, struggling to keep it from tipping. A senior nun watches silently, then finally says, "Next time, roll from the bottom, not the side." The girl nods, cheeks pink, but grinning. Brewing wasn't just about beer. It was about discipline, observation, and yes, a little trial by spillage. You walk toward the back corner where a ledger sits open on a small desk. It tracks deliveries and payments, inked in cramped Latin abbreviations. Your eyes skim the entries. One marked, priestly ration. Another simply, feast beer, twice strength. It's a quiet record of generosity, barter, obligation, and a little mischief. A footnote catches your eye. No deliveries next week. Barrel sprung leak and stained the altar linens. You try not to laugh too loudly. Imagine explaining that to the bishop. It's hard not to be impressed by how thoroughly the nuns owned their process. From recipe to fermentation, from ladling mash to hauling barrels, they were brewers in every sense of the word. And because they were cloistered, they had to be everything. Chemists, merchants, mechanics, and sometimes even diplomats. If a local noble wanted stronger beer for his feast, someone had to negotiate that order without giving away the entire winter's supply. That someone was often a nun with ink-stained fingers and a no-nonsense tone. You walk back through the bottling room, careful not to trip over any tools or sleepy novices. The sisters are winding down. Bottles are labeled. Shelves are stocked. Jugs are cooled and humming quietly, as if content with their fermentation. The air is thick with effort and barley and the sense of a job done well, even if no one outside these walls will ever fully appreciate it. Just as you're about to leave the room, a sister taps you gently on the shoulder and hands you a tiny cup. It's warm. You take a sip. It's earthy, nutty, a little sharp. It tastes like the inside of the convent smells, like something old and intentional, brewed with care and a bit of cheeky daring. She smiles and says, "Not our best batch, but better than the bishop's." You nod solemnly. You're not sure if she means quality or alcohol content. Maybe both. You follow the narrow hallway away from the bottling chamber, the soft weight of that last sip still lingering on your tongue. The convent is quieter now, like the whole building is exhaling. Even the pigeons outside the window ledges seem to have called it a night. Your next steps take you past another archway and into a smaller room lit with just one oil lamp and a half-shuttered window. This is where the real behind-the-scenes magic happened. Not brewing or bottling, but writing, negotiating, and occasionally, outwitting those who underestimated cloistered women with nothing to lose and everything to document. This, friend, is the convent's scriptorium/ledger office, where brewing wasn't only a physical labor. It was a legal, financial, and, dare we say, political maneuver. These nuns didn't just brew for the joy of a foamy top. They brewed to survive, to negotiate power, to assert independence in a world that often refused to see women's work as anything but decorative embroidery or saintly martyrdom. You approach a desk, where a sister with ink-stained fingers is hunched over parchment, her quill scratching quietly in the dim. She's not writing a sermon. She's drafting a contract, one for a beer exchange with a neighboring priory. You notice the way she phrases the agreement. Exact quantities, delivery dates, and a little note stipulating the return of the barrels. She underlines it twice. Someone's been stiffed before. And here comes your mainstream historical fact. Though many nunneries were under spiritual oversight from bishops or male abbots, they often handled their own business affairs. Brewing, in particular, gave them a kind of soft leverage, especially when local communities relied on their beer. There are recorded cases of convents negotiating prices, setting production quotas, and even refusing to brew for certain lords if they hadn't fulfilled previous donations. A sister from the corner clears her throat and reads aloud from another document. "If the ale arrives warm again, we shall not accept it." Her voice is calm but unshakable. She's negotiating freshness like it's a matter of theology. And honestly, kind of is. This wasn't just beverage commerce, it was a moral, almost sacred contract between the maker and the drinker. Serve a spoiled brew, and it wasn't just bad business. It was bad karma. Here's your fringe tidbit of the evening. Some nuns used beer labels to subtly mark their discontent. One brewing order, possibly frustrated with delayed payments from clergy, began stamping their barrels with psalms about fairness and divine justice. Not exactly passive-aggressive, but close. A cask stamped with "Let justice roll down like waters" hits a little differently when you're 2 weeks late on payment. You settle onto a stool beside a wall shelf lined with ledgers. And here's where the scholarly arguments come in. Historians still argue whether these business roles were empowering in a feminist sense, or simply part of an overburdened workload forced upon nuns when male-run institutions wouldn't help them. Some see these brewing nuns as proto-entrepreneurs, thriving under restriction. Others suggest they were just plugging holes in broken systems. Cleverly, yes, but under compulsion. You get the feeling the truth lives somewhere in the inky margins. The sister beside you stretches her fingers and offers you a look. "Hard to get good parchment these days," she mutters. "Had to trade last week's hop surplus to the monks for some that wasn't covered in beetle holes." You nod sympathetically. The monk trade economy was more barter than capitalism. Goods, services, blessings, and yes, beer. You watch her switch quills and start a new page. This time, she's sketching something, what looks like a stylized wheat stalk with a halo around it. You blink. Is that Saint Arnold of Soissons, the patron saint of brewers? It is. She's designing a new seal. "Looks a bit smug," you whisper. She shrugs. "He always does. That's the thing, they knew their symbols. Saint Arnold, Saint Brigid, even the Virgin Mary sometimes appeared in brewery lore. Some convents claimed divine inspiration for their brewing success. Others framed it as an act of hospitality. offering safe drink to travelers and locals in a world where water could be, well, let's just say full of unwelcome surprises. A gust of wind tugs the shutters open, and you glimpse the moon rising. Another sister enters the room, holding a small crate of items, parchments, wax seals, even a little wooden stamp shaped like a bee. For the honey batch jugs, she explains, setting it down. Each item is treated like treasure, because in many ways it is. These were tools of survival. Branding before branding, packaging before mass marketing. The medieval nun knew her product. And here's something even stranger. Some convents brewed under what we'd now call private label deals. That's right. Other religious houses or towns might contract the nuns to make beer on their behalf, while putting a different abbey's name on it. You could call it outsourcing medieval edition. You lean back as another sister reads a letter from a neighboring town. It's a request urgent for our strongest and most agreeable batch, intended for a wedding celebration. She raises an eyebrow. Guess someone's hoping for cheerful in-laws. They all laugh. Not loudly, but warmly. That quiet, knowing kind of laugh that echoes in stone rooms and survives the centuries. As you glance around the room, it becomes clear that, for these women, brewing wasn't just science or spirituality. It was strategy. Every ounce measured, every coin tracked, every note recorded with the same reverence given to Scripture. Not because the beer itself was holy, but because the independence it gave them was. You look again at that little stylized saint on the parchment. Halo, tunic, barley stalk. His face may be smug, but he's perched on something sacred. A keg marked with the initials of the convent. Beneath it, in Latin, the words read, "Work humbly, brew wisely." The sisters aren't here to be remembered. They're here to endure. And this brew, this strange, barley-soaked testimony, is their way of doing it. You leave the ledger room behind, the faint scent of ink still clinging to your nostrils, and follow the gentle thrum of humming, barely more than a breath, down the corridor. The air shifts again as you pass through another threshold, and suddenly you're standing at the heart of the convent's refectory, the communal dining hall. Long wooden tables stretch across the stone floor, worn smooth by centuries of elbows, bowls, and sleepy heads resting in mid-prayer. Here's where the nuns took their meals, their ale, and occasionally, a moment to just be. No chants, no charts, just the warm slosh of a shared jug passed gently from hand to hand. What's more surprising is this. Beer wasn't merely for the brewmasters or the guests. It was part of the sisters' daily sustenance. In fact, many medieval nunneries provided each sister with a daily ration of beer, typically between 1 and 2 liters. And no, it wasn't some wild bacchanal. It was what's known as small beer, low in alcohol, high in nutrients, and far safer than the local stream. You sit at one of the benches, the wood creaking under your weight, and imagine the quiet routine. A bell rings, sandals shuffle in. A sister reads from Scripture while the rest chew their coarse bread and sip from earthenware cups. No chit-chat, just the sound of spoons, distant birdsong, and the occasional hiccup someone tries and fails to smother. And here's your mainstream historical fact for this chapter. During fasting periods, which took up to 40% of the calendar year in some orders, solid food was severely restricted. But, and here's the divine loophole, beer didn't count. Liquid nourishment, they called it. So beer became not only a staple, but a sneaky little indulgence during the long days of Lent, Advent, and every saint's feast that required some form of abstention. You reach for an imaginary cup, and in your mind's eye, it's warm, just slightly foamy, the barley giving it a nutty edge. It's not strong enough to get you tipsy, but just hearty enough to make you forget the meager bowl of turnip stew beside it. Now, let's drop in that lovely fringe fact. Some nunneries brewed seasonal alesh specifically for feast days. These were often richer, spiced, or sweetened with herbs, and saved for holy celebrations. St. Bridget's Day, honey beer. Easter, a floral blend with rosemary or marjoram. The good stuff saved for the holiest moods. There's even some evidence, though patchy, that certain convents brewed darker, richer alesh for older nuns who were too frail to eat solid food. Beer as a meal replacement? Honestly, could be worse. One sister near the back of the room lets out a delicate sneeze and wipes her nose with a linen scrap. Another nods sympathetically and hands over a warm stone bottle. Steamed ale with thyme. Maybe? Brewing wasn't just nourishment, it was medieval medicine. The herbs weren't just for flavor, they were part of an entire folk pharmacopoeia. Sage to soothe the throat. Yarrow for upset stomachs. Chamomile for those, more prayerful digestive issues. Here's where the scholarly debate pours in, slow and foamy. Historians still argue whether beer was truly a centerpiece of nunnery's internal life or just a convenient placeholder in monastic records. Some claim it was overemphasized by male scribes who couldn't resist poking fun at tipsy nuns. Others believe beer was a crucial part of female religious autonomy, taken seriously and reverently, with recipes passed down like psalms. You get the sense the truth's probably a little of both. Somewhere between satire and sacrament, there's a humble mug of ale that got someone through a hard fast, a cold evening, or a long reading from Leviticus. A younger sister shuffles into view carrying a tray of small clay cups. She notices you sitting there, watching, and gently places one in front of you. "Don't worry," she says, barely above a whisper. "It's the mild batch." You raise it in silent thanks, and she chuckles. Third tap on the left. "Never trust the one with the squirrel carved into it." Wait, squirrel? Yes? Apparently, some convents mark their barrels with little carvings, animals, stars, symbols of saints, to help keep track of flavor or potency. One nun's lamb barrel might be lighter than Sister Agnes's ominous owl cask. This makes you wonder. Did they ever prank each other with swap taps? Maybe once or twice. Another sister, older, with a face like weathered parchment, smiles from her corner seat. She's holding a rosary, but she's also nursing what looks like a well-earned brew. "We bless our work," she says, "and we drink our blessings." And just when you think this is the coziest it gets, she adds, "But don't get Sister Hilda drunk. She debates canon law when tipsy. We missed Vespers twice last Lent." You smile, content now to just sit in this moment. The sounds soften, barefoot steps, distant wind, a gentle whistle from the fire-heated stones. The refectory is not silent, but it is peaceful in that way old stone spaces can be. Like the air's been thickened by stories and seasons. Here, beer isn't rebellion or ritual. It's rhythm. A rhythm of care, of endurance, of women carving out agency with barrels, buckets, and yeast. You look down at the cup in your hands, imaginary maybe, but still warm. It tastes of barley and sisterhood and centuries. And just as you begin to feel the day's weight settle gently into your shoulders, the old sister looks over at you again. "Don't fall asleep yet," she winks. "You haven't seen the garden." You step outside with the faintest buzz of comfort in your belly. Not from alcohol, but from the sheer warmth of the scene you've just left. The convent garden unfurls before you like a patchwork quilt of green, gold, and soil-dark browns. And though it's not grand or meticulously sculpted like a royal courtyard, it carries that simple, lived-in beauty that only comes from women who know what plants want. Or maybe what they need. The scent hits first. Lemon balm, mugwort, hops vines stretching like lazy cats along the old stone walls, and somewhere, a soft trace of wormwood. Not a tourist's herb garden, this one. It's a brewer's haven. See, the thing is, medieval convents didn't just brew beer, they grew beer. Or at least the ingredients. And they did it with an almost stubborn pride. You spot rows of barley shimmering in the breeze, small clutches of coriander, and tall stalks of fennel swaying like sleepy sentries at the edge of the world. And just when you think you've seen everything, a squat little building emerges from behind a hedgerow. It's built low, with a mossy roof and soot-darkened chimney. Inside, the garden brewery. Yes, some nunneries had entirely separate brewing huts tucked away on the grounds, sometimes to hide the heat, sometimes to keep the smell from soaking into the chapel's vestments. You duck inside, inhaling a wave of yeasty sweetness and warm wood. The air is thick with history and hops. This is where Sister Else might have stood, sleeves rolled up, whispering Psalm 23 while skimming the scum from the top of a gently boiling pot. Where Sister Gertrude, elbow-deep in grain sacks, might have cracked a joke about the angel Gabriel not showing up unless the wort was just right. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. Many of the same herbs and flowers grown in convent gardens were used not only for brewing, but for medicine, dye, and food. Hops, for instance, weren't widely used in beer until around the 11th or 12th centuries, and even then it was often women, nuns included, who led the charge in experimenting with the new ingredient. Before hops, grut, an herbal mix that varied by region, think bog myrtle, yarrow, and mugwort. Earthy, fragrant, and sometimes a bit trippy. You reach out to brush a drying bundle of herbs strung along a low beam. One smells like mint, another like hay, and the third? Possibly marigold, though your modern nose can't quite place it. The brewing hut is small, but every surface hums with intention. Clay bottles wait patiently in a crate. A wooden paddle leans against the hearth. A copper kettle rests over long-dead embers. Even now, centuries later, it smells alive. Like comfort, like effort, like care. And here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some nuns inscribed prayers or protective charms onto the inside of their fermentation barrels. Latin blessings etched in charcoal, or symbols carved under the lid to ward off spoilage. Fermentation wasn't just chemistry, it was faith, and maybe just a sprinkle of superstition. One historian, very serious chap, you imagine him adjusting his spectacles in candlelight, insists that these charms were purely ornamental. Another swears they were sincere attempts to coax divine favor into every barrel. Historians still argue whether these markings were ritual protection or merely decorative tradition, but you can't help picturing a nun in the twilight hours, mumbling an Ave Maria while drawing a small fish symbol beneath the rim of a keg. You turn, and there's Sister Johanna, sitting on an overturned bucket near the door, shelling dried hops into a basket. You know, she says in a voice like velvet and dust, a good beer needs patience, just like prayer. You nod. She tosses you a little hop cone. You squeeze it gently. It's papery, aromatic, and sticky with resin. She smiles. And don't believe Brother Martin when he says we can't brew better than the monks. He fainted last time he tried our Easter special. Outside, the sun dips behind the convent's stone archways. The garden glows, golden and calm. You walk the rows slowly now, letting your fingers brush across thyme and lavender. Not just for brewing. These herbs also went into tonics, teas, poultices, and on rare occasion, into experimental batches Sister Catherine called restful alish. Some were said to help with sleep, others with nerves, and one, if local gossip is to be believed, could get even the prioress giggling before Compline. One more debate for the ages. Were nun brewers respected as medical experts because of their herbal knowledge, or were they simply playing the role assigned to them by monastic life? Some say they were proto-pharmacists. Others argue they were just filling gaps left by male clergy who weren't interested in women's work. Either way, those dusty herb journals and margin-scribbled recipes suggest one thing. They knew what they were doing. The final path through the garden bends beneath a willow, and as you pass under, the wind rustles the branches like soft chimes. You stop, breathe, listen. Somewhere behind you, a soft clink. A barrel settling into place. A bird chirping above the hops trellis. And maybe, just maybe, a chuckle from a ghostly nun who's proud of her last batch. The convent isn't a place of silence. Really, it's a place of layers. Of effort and quiet rebellion. Of ritual and rest. And yes, of really, really good beer. You settle onto a bench near the old well, letting the scent of lemon verbena drift up. The sun is gone now, but the air still holds its warmth. This is the end of the day. The nuns will soon be lighting candles for evening prayers. But you're already sinking, slowly, into the soft earth of the past, and the soft quiet of now.